Brendan Gutenschwager is back. Brendan, you are a prolific independent journalist at this point who has been at some of the most consequential events of the last year and a half. And one of them was the Kyle Rittenhouse shootings. And you are in Kenosha right now. You're waiting for the verdict. And we haven't heard from you on my channel yet, anyway, about this. And I've been wanting to talk to you because you were actually there for the second and the third shootings. And I know that when we talked a little bit ago, you were concerned about discussing it as the trial was ongoing. And I honestly think that was a good decision. And I totally respect that you wanted to maintain your distance from that. Now that the jury is deliberating, you've been gracious enough to talk a little bit about it. Before we get into what it's like seeing your video up in this case, can you take me back to that night and describe what you remember about it? Because I just think your perspective is one that we would all really benefit from hearing from. And again, thank you for being willing to talk about this.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you for that. Yeah, so going back to August of 2020 when all of this happened, this was in the aftermath of the Jacob Blake shooting. And so that had happened on August 23rd. That night, they had some pretty significant riots in the city. I was not there that night, but the following night, that Monday, I had been present for, again, very volatile night, fire set, several buildings burned down. And then going into the third day of this was that Tuesday, August 25th, 2020. That is the day that is being examined and dissected in very fine detail here with this court case. And that was the night of the shootings. And what I personally had witnessed there, for those that are somewhat familiar with the trial, and that there's different shootings that are in question here, each of which has its own charges. And there was the first one with Joseph Rosenbaum that I did not see. The ones that I had were the second and third, and had gotten video of that. Those are the incidents with Anthony Huber and Gage Grosskreutz. And so that all took place back in August. Very, very tense and volatile time. The way I've been describing it has been kind of a dark atmosphere over the city around that time. Nobody knew what was going to happen next. It was very unpredictable as those nights went on. And, ultimately had this fatal shooting that occurred and happened right in front of me.
I'm assuming then that you knew immediately that, or I don't know, maybe you didn't, that your video of that was going to be used in some way, whether an investigation or now a trial. Did you have any sense of the history, I guess, that you were witnessing in that moment and the meaning that it would have for this country and just the interest that so many people have in it?
At the time, I really didn't, and that was largely in part to not really having the time to process it. Everything that happened there in Kenosha and the days that followed was so fast. The way I've described it was truly the craziest week of my life at the time. It was just going at 150 miles an hour. There was no time to process anything, even the things that were happening right in front of me. Like just trying to even go take 5 minutes to get some food was like a huge endeavor to try to squeeze everything in. It was just chaotic. And so there really wasn't a whole lot of time to be thinking more of the long-term implications. It was more so just hit the ground running, and we're running, and we're running, and we're really not having the time to stop and think about that. That being said, now a little over a year removed from it and kind of seeing it all analyzed, slowed down, taken minute by minute how things unfolded that night, now I start to see more of that historic significance and the way that it has really been a pivotal capture in what happened that night and in trying to for better understand for those that were there what happened and how it occurred.
What has it been like for you watching your video used in the trial?
It's been kind of left me speechless for the most part. I don't really know how to react to seeing video of mine analyzed in this level of detail. I mean, most of what I've done has been news coverage, so it's, you know, it's of interest that night or it's of interest for a few days. And then there's different news cycles. And there's been some things that have been more long form, documentary type. But this in particular is just like a whole nother level. I mean, you had this tragic incident unfolds and happen to be one of the few there that capture it. Most of the networks, like the main networks, better known ones, they didn't have cameras right there. They either weren't there altogether, had left early, were in a different location. And so I just don't even know how to react, honestly. I'm still kind of processing all of that. It has given me more insight to kind of analyze things and be able to take it slower, you know, without the distractions of the immediacy of it all. Because early on, it was like, okay, this is breaking news, and there was that whole aspect of it. Now is the moment to actually be able to slow it down, to be able to fully understand what occurred, and to be able to really, really dig into that. So in that sense, it's been kind of, I don't know the proper term to use for it, if like relief would be a good example. Just basically a moment to better understand what I witnessed, and that's been somewhat relieving in my own mind.
I'm curious, Brendan, you said that it was what did you say, the craziest week of your life, I think, or craziest few days, which says a lot considering where you've been over the last few years. You were at the Capitol on January 6th. You've been to some of the most intense protests and riots across the country. Why was this that significant for you? Why does this one stand out in your mind?
Part of it was the shock of seeing something like this occur in a not very well-known town. You know, it's one thing when there's these demonstrations in DC or New York or Portland, you know, cities that everybody's heard of and known and that tend to have fairly frequent demonstrations, protests, whatever. This, I mean, it just escalated so quickly and it got so volatile. I mean, there were at times you'd see an entire block of buildings just on fire. The only thing I could really compare it to in recent memory in the US was the Minneapolis riots. But even those, like, it kind of had more of a national lens on it and national review of it. And Kenosha, by comparison, was this town most people had never heard of, Midwest USA, and all of a sudden just erupted into these. It was a combination of peaceful protests, violent riots, all of it. And to see it all occur in such a compact area and a city that just did not seem equipped for this, that clearly had not had anything like this happen before. And the response just seemed so haphazard at times that it just seems like people were really unprepared for this. And with how quickly it all unfolded, it just, as I said earlier, it became this like running at 150 miles per hour thing. Almost all businesses boarded up in the area. You couldn't even find food past 6 p.m. because every business was closed. So you were just like struggling to like, you know, go outside of town to be able to stop at a store just to be able to like have something to eat for the evening because you knew you wouldn't be able to get anything. So it was crazy. There was very, very, very little sleep that week. And that also kind of just added to the chaoticness of it all. And yeah, I mean, it is definitely an unforgettable one.
What do you think about how the corporate media has covered this case, given that you were one of the few to actually really be there? And you were mentioning, I think you said something about how some of them were there, but they didn't have their cameras. Did you see a lot of this sort of big name press there, or were the people there that were covering this mostly people just like you who are just working on your own? And I'm just curious because it seems like folks like yourself may have a different perspective on what happened because you were actually there. And that the further that people get, it's like the telephone game, and it just, these maybe inaccuracies continue to get repeated because more and more we're seeing people like you are actually doing the legwork, and then they're using your video, but then commenting on it, not having seen the entire context.
I'm glad that you brought up the telephone analogy, because I had just brought that up to somebody a couple of days ago with relation to this specifically. And you're exactly right. It's the further removed you get from the original primary source, the more people add in opinions or add in narratives, try to connect it to things that it actually was never connected to begin with, but they want to make some kind of analogy just to kind of bring it into some national storyline or national narrative. You know, and with regards to who I saw that night, I mean, mainstream cameras were out, but they largely stayed near the courthouse. So when things were dispersed away from the courthouse, a lot of them stayed there or they went home. There were several that I watched go home early that night. And so they just simply were not out when all of this occurred. It happened just about 11:48 p.m., I think, was when the first shots with this specific incident, although there were shots going on throughout the night. And yeah, I think that Kenosha highlighted more than most other cities did the value of independent reporting and just the way that those independents kind of rose up to fill that gap. Because the legacy media outlets were largely confined to the area around the courthouse, same place that they're positioned right now. And, you know, and they do their specific, you know, hits at a certain time and, you know, be on camera here and, you know, just give the update, as opposed to just like truly staying with the event to see how it unfolds minute by minute. And yeah, I think that made a huge difference. I think that it really was highlighted in just seeing like what kind of coverage came out of there, what ended up being some of the most pivotal coverage, and it by and large was people that independently reported, and not just myself. I mean, several others throughout this process. I have seen videos. Some of them I had already seen shortly after all this occurred. Others I'm kind of seeing now for the first time. And time again, it's being brought up. It's, hey, here's this person that just goes out and films things locally. Here's this person that just kind of goes out and covers protests, stuff like that, independently. And I think that this in particular really highlighted that more than the vast majority of places that I've gone and covered.
Would you like to describe what's going on there right now? What is it like waiting for the verdict to come in? And are there a lot of journalists there right now compared to that night when it happened?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a huge pool of media out there right now. They've virtually surrounded two sides of the park. You can't park on some of the sides, but with just all the different news vans and crews, camera setups with the lighting and whatnot. And not too many protesters. I would say at most, the most that I've seen is like 3 dozen or so. And that kind of fluctuates throughout the day. Not too many very early on in the day, but more as it gets into the afternoon. It's been peaceful. You know, there have been some verbal confrontations and altercations. Pretty much, you know, the most extreme end of any kind of like confrontation I've seen was somebody taking somebody's poster, ripping up. It wasn't even quite clear what preceded that. So other than that, it's been largely peaceful, people chanting on both sides. And there's been demonstrators that are calling for an acquittal of Kyle Rittenhouse, feel that he acted in self-defense and want to see basically the charges dropped. And there's others that have been out here calling for the conviction and calling for him to be charged on all 5 counts that are currently up for consideration for the jury. So, you know, people, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, are there more on one versus the other side?
That also fluctuates throughout the day. So I've found that early on in the day, there tend to be more, you could say like in support. The way that they've described it is not necessarily explicitly in support of Kyle Rittenhouse. They've described themselves as like Second Amendment supporters or supporting right to self-defense. You could kind of put it all in that same category. I tend to see more of those early on in the day. compared to the ones that are anti-Kyle Rittenhouse want to see conviction. And then as the day goes on, more of the ones calling for the conviction arrive. So like right now in particular, the ratio is definitely tipped towards people calling for the conviction. But it fluctuates a bit, and it never in total across all of those, never gets more than a few dozen the last couple of days.
Do you get a sense of what people are planning to do given one verdict versus another verdict, or is it sort of just like a wait and see where we have no clue what it could look like?
It definitely is like a wait and see kind of vibe that I've gotten. I don't hear any specifics on, hey, if this happens, then this. I haven't really seen any indication to believe that there'd be some kind of mass demonstration for either potential result. And so right now, it definitely seems like people are kind of in a wait and see mode. They've brought out a speaker to be able to listen to live streams. There aren't too many moments with that because most of it's just jury deliberations, but there's been times like this afternoon where the judge is discussing with the attorneys just the process for the jury reviewing video. So people put that live stream out on the speakers, although all of it is happening in the courtroom right there. So some people do actually go inside and just listen to it in person, most outside though. And yeah, it pretty much just everybody gathered around and waiting to see what will happen next.
Anything else you'd like to add, Brendan, before we go? I really appreciate your taking the time.
Right now, it's, I don't think there is much more to add. It's really been a big kind of, well, I'll see what happens. Everybody just kind of waiting. Now it's looking like there could be actually a few different potential outcomes here. So it's really become a bit unpredictable. But it's been it's been an interesting feeling to kind of see this story through to the end here. Obviously, having been there that night it's in its own thing an incredible, like, volatile situation and kind of difficult to cope with and grasp. But as time has gone on now, to be able to kind of see where this comes full circle, and now that it's actually being put to an actual trial, it's from a journalistic perspective, I think it's been at least a nice thing to see, to get some degree of, I don't know if closure is the right word, but just kind of more completeness of the story, because there were definitely a lot of unanswered questions from that night, and this is giving an opportunity for some of those questions to finally be answered.
I did think of one other. Did you ever get approached by law enforcement for potential testimony, or did they ask for your video, or was your video just taken from the internet?
Yeah, because it was actually tweeted out in full, the video of that shooting. So they actually just got it from social media. They even, you can see on one of the file names when it was pulled up, you could see BG on the scene Twitter video, and it has like the watermark in there. So that was the extent of it. And yeah, and that was pretty much all with that.
So that night, I'm assuming, like, so the shooting happens and then you're just there on scene. They didn't try to pull people over to say, hey, we want to hear what you saw, or anything like that. No contact with law enforcement. They just took your video and used it accordingly.
Yeah, at the time that night, there was nobody being stopped or kind of taken aside to see what they would. People, if they volunteered to go walk up and talk, did. And there were a few that did that day, like right after it happened. But it seemed more, given the tensions in the air and just how volatile everything was, that they were just trying to clear the crowd out and kind of secure the crime scene. So yeah, it doesn't, traditionally maybe you would see more of that with, like, actually like, hey, wait, this person was right here, you probably saw something. It's possible that they might have gone back a few days later, try to do some of that, but definitely not right there that night on the scene.
Interesting. Well, everybody go check out Brendan on Twitter, BG on the scene, and then from your Twitter account, they can find ways to support you, right, Brendan?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also other channels as well. If people prefer Instagram,
Right.
YouTube, Telegram, same username, BG on the scene. So
Okay.
easy to find on any of them. Twitter is like the most newest updates on things. So.
Okay. Yes. But yeah, I can't encourage people enough to support your work. I have supported your work in the past. I'm going to go to the Brendan tip jar too, right after this interview, because your work really is invaluable for those of us who are trying to cut through the noise from all the different commentators and just get to the source. And without video like yours and without people like you willing to, I mean, really, you're risking your life in some of these cases to be there, Brendan. We wouldn't know what's going on. So I can't thank you enough for the work you do and for taking the time to come on and talk about it.
And thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you taking the time to ask people that were there and try to get a better understanding of what happened at these different things. So that's appreciated likewise.
Absolutely.